Hello, and welcome back to Public Spin Forum's learning path on buying digital services. Our particular focus in this path is the Digital Services Playbook. My name is Frank McNally. I'm the Director of Learning and Content Development here at Public Spin Forum, and I'm joined as always by my good friend Neil Chaudhry, President of Vidya. Hey, Neil.
Hi, Frank. Good to be with you.
It's great to have you here. Those of you who had joined us in our first introduction basically to the Digital Services Playbook kind of get the gist here of what we're doing. So we're trying to help acquisition professionals specifically understand what the Digital Services Playbook is and appreciate why it matters for federal procurement. They talk about plays, right? There's 13 plays in the Digital Services Playbook. Neil, why do they call them plays?
The plays represent steps you can take in order to maximize the value from your digital services effort.
Right on. And like I mentioned, there's 13 of them. As we go through this series, we're going to touch on each one, right? Looking for the practical techniques and outcomes that acquisition professionals can use and literally like apply on their job today to acquire digital services in a more efficient and effective manner. So all of the content here is going to be up on the Public Spin Forum Learning Corner. I've got the web address down there. We'll also be pasting it across social media. Hopefully it'll be easy to find us, but you can always find us through publicspinforum.net. So in the introduction to this series, as I mentioned, Neil and I actually went through and mapped each of the 13 plays to the acquisition lifecycle. I wanted to do that just to help you guys understand, like, if I'm acquiring digital services, how do I use the playbook throughout the acquisition lifecycle to support and ultimately design a contract that enables delivery? So if you missed that, I definitely recommend you going back and checking that out. It's about 40 minutes of content, but maybe I'm biased, Neil, but I thought it was pretty good time spent. So in this series, we want to look at play one, which is understand what people need. Now, in each play, there is a checklist, right? After the general introduction of what that play is, there's a checklist, and I think that's where it attempts to get more actionable. And do you agree there, Neil? Is kind of that the point of those checklist items?
Yeah, so basically the plays get to common challenges you'll face in any digital services effort. And the checklist helps get to what kind of practical things you can apply in order to solve whatever problem you're encountering at that time.
So let's look at play one, understand what people need. And as I mentioned, there's this checklist in every play. So first up is to, early in the project, spend time with current and prospective users of the service. So Neil, who are the users of the service in your opinion?
Well, for an acquisition professional, it's going to be certainly some subset of the American taxpayer, but really it's going to be anyone who stands to benefit from using the service. It could be an actual user. It could be a stakeholder who seeks to improve the profile of his or her agency. To me, the term user is actually pretty broad. It's anyone who hopes to gain something from deploying the service.
Yeah, right. I mean, because you're building the digital service for somebody, right? Or maybe even something. But at any rate, just getting out there and communicating with users, the people who stand to benefit or use that service, is going to add a lot of value to your acquisition plan. Like, don't presume that you know what they need. Get out of your office or your cube and go talk with them, with those program owners, right? Because oftentimes the product owner or the program office, they're going to be doing this. But there are ways that you can get involved. Ask to shadow the team when they start to conduct this communication. Request to be debriefed right after these conversations occur. You can't just make the demand, though. Like, you've got to prove to the overall team that there's going to be value as a result of that time spent. So what you can say, in my opinion, is like, hey guys, let me know what the users are saying, because I'm trying to develop this acquisition plan that's going to inform ultimately the contract that we go out for. So, it's not enough just to say, hey, I want to be involved, without saying, here's the reason why. And a big reason why you want to be involved in that user conversation is to inform your market research. I think that's critical to a well-designed acquisition strategy. The user feedback tells you a lot. I mean, what does it tell you, Neil, sort of in the software realm?
Well, This is almost an intuitively obvious play, but I think it's important to understand that while we all feel we're building what people want, that it's important to actually validate that,
Mm-hmm.
to actually test our hypotheses and confirm that they're correct. Despite our best intentions, we might be wrong. And so it's important to actually confirm what we believe. And the best way to do that is to build a lightweight, cheap, minimum viable product that we can then show our users, have them react to, and then give us some meaningful data off which we can then make future decisions.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that minimum viable products and prototyping as we go along. I think an important part too of this process of this effort of just spending time with users is that this feedback ultimately, and it's not linear, it's not one-to-one, but ultimately this user feedback is going to be translated into some sort of requirements document. Now, Neil and I have gone back and forth on this a good bit. He wants me to make sure I clarify that when I talk about a requirements document, I'm not talking about software requirements. I'm talking about things like the statement of objectives or the statement of work or the performance work statement. That requirements document, you acquisition professionals out there understand what that means. And so you can see right away how your participation in the user interview process will ultimately make the market research better and will ultimately inform a requirements document that gets more at the heart of what actually is needed as a result of this digital service acquisition. But before I move on, let's talk really quickly about the user's needs versus the contractual requirement. So, Neil, you just talked about it. User needs being all the stuff that a user might need or want to complete a given task, and you guys call that features or functionality or something like that.
Yeah, so we tend to think of user needs as features, as coarse-grained features that comprise of multiple tasks that a user wants to perform, but ultimately just one block of work that a user wants to perform when interacting with the service.
Mm-hmm. So the user needs, that's the stuff that they want to be doing. It's not necessarily the same as the requirements document. There's a group out there called the Standish Group. They do this chaos report. I think it's biannual or every other year. And what they found is that actually in any software package or any product, traditionally about 64% of the features have been rarely or never used. So think about things like mail merge in Microsoft Word or motion paths in PowerPoint. Useful features, I'm sure, to certain professionals, but probably not so widely used. And there's probably even features that are more rare than the ones I just described. But the point is that the requirements document is going to be that formal document that basically describes what the contractor will deliver or the outcomes we're hoping that they will provide in consideration for the government's payment. So not every user need necessarily is something that makes its way into the final product. Am I right there, Neil, or would you
Yeah,
maybe
so
qualify
the tech
that?
bar is very smart to distinguish between, as you mentioned, contract requirements and system requirements. And system requirements kind of scare me. They harken back to a dark time when orcs roamed Middle Earth, where basically you had these very long, detailed descriptions of the requirements that extended out even years, which ultimately proved to be a waste of money and poor planning and a waterfall effort. So I try to shy away from system requirements, but certainly for an acquisition professional, contract requirements are very important. And knowing how a user's needs and the user's needs for various features factor into the contract requirements document is very important. Mm-hmm. And the list of features ultimately are what's going to matter to the vendor, to the delivery team, as far as delivering working software.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're gonna keep talking about this, by the way, because this can be a complicated notion. But as we continue on our journey here, we are gonna to discuss this difference here and how it really comes across in the acquisition process, right? I mean, the last thing you want to do, I think we would both agree, is take everything that could possibly ever be needed by a digital service and stuff it into the requirements document. I mean, as soon as you do that, you're on your way to waterfall pretty quick. So we don't want
Absolutely.
that.
And that's why it's very important to, rather than necessarily just conduct interviews where people might articulate desires for functionality that they think they need, but they really don't, to put those lightweight MVPs in front of them so they can react to something tangible, and then you probably get much better feedback about what really matters.
Yeah. Yeah, and that stuff, that is important. I mean, that feedback about what really matters is telling us what to prioritize ultimately. But as the checklist for Play One continues, we start to get into that, right? Because it's telling us use a range of qualitative and quantitative research methods to determine people's goals or their needs or their behaviors. And it reminds us to be thoughtful about the time spent. So one thing here is I read qualitative and quantitative. I had slightly different take on this, but Neil, like we both agreed, there's quantitative efforts, right? Using existing survey or existing data or user analytics that you can get through Google, right? Or anything like that. I think you'd want to look at first. I have surveys on here as an item. I would caution all of you out there in the federal market and especially in the government to be aware of the Paperwork Reduction Act and what this actually means is a pretty significant restriction on conducting surveys. Neil, you want to talk about how quantitative input sort of feeds this user story process, right? Or the collection of user stories. So spend a minute and kind of tell them what you told me when we were talking about this.
Sure. So basically, your quantitative research, your MVP, will help guide you to verifying your hypotheses and probably showing you things that you never thought were true, that features that you thought didn't matter actually matter more, and features that you thought were high priority or very useful to users don't matter much to them. And so you'll refine your point of view on what matters and what doesn't, and pivot or persevere, to use the lean thinking terminology. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, when you have a good idea of what users truly want, as validated through the learning you received from these objective experiments, then you can start to actually distill what you've learned into user stories, which describe coarse-grained functionality for how the user wants to interact with the service. And excuse me, in Scrum, you basically have this canonical notion of, as a certain kind of user, you want to perform a certain action in order to then produce a certain result for a particular purpose. A common example might be, as a customer, I would like to pay by credit card so I can enjoy the convenience. And so that's a very coarse-grained feature, because when you think about it, there's a lot of things going on there. There's user interface design for the page, for the form. There's security concerns to make sure that your credit card number is secure and encrypted. There's a lot of things going on there under the hood of what seems like a very simple story. But ultimately, those user stories are the features, the functionality that we want to deliver to our end user.
Right on. And so as we do that, one way that we can collect user stories and that other type of quantitative information is to test prototypes of solutions with real people in the field. And a great case study demonstrating this came out just this past September. From the Department of Education. They were designing this college this college scorecard application, right, to help students make, I assume, better decisions about their college choice. So they wanted to develop a smartphone app, and so they built a cardboard smartphone with sheets of paper to sort of simulate the user experience, and they took that out there and they said, hey, interact with this. How cool is that even a cardboard smartphone can provide meaningful results? So I definitely invite you guys to take a look at that case study, read it, because it's really cool. Anything you want to say on that, Neil?
Just that it's a very cheap and lightweight way to get real results from users as to what they want. And these experiments are critical to making sure that we maximize the value of taxpayer dollars.
Neil, quick curveball, because we didn't discuss this, but I am curious. So would that cardboard smartphone be an example of a minimum viable product? And if not, why not?
It's almost an ideal example of a minimum viable product, because it represents a digital service in a cheap, lightweight way. And it still allows enough feedback from the user where they can actually get some sense of what it would be like to use it. Now, this is a particularly ingenious approach. If you want to be a little bit more technological, I guess, You could perhaps build a wireframe, which is basically a sketch of what a user interface might look like. You could do that as well. You can maybe even build a very simple version of a real app. Either way. But ultimately, you want to do something you can deliver within a week or two at most, and then get that out to users so they can give you their feedback as to what works and what doesn't.
Nice. I think I left that curveball a little high because you just drove that one pretty far. Nicely done. And interesting. So next up in this checklist is to document the findings about user goals, needs, behaviors, and preferences, and then more importantly to me, share those findings with your team and with agency leadership. So you're going out there and you're collecting information, right? Like these user stories, the results of your user input, the data that you're collecting, program decisions that get made, market research results, all this stuff, very important artifacts for the contract file. And I tell folks, and all the time, and you probably heard this before, but the time to start building your the time to start building your contract file is not in the award phase. It's not after you've awarded the contract. You start building that contract file in the planning phase. You are documenting it with your findings, et cetera, et cetera. Look, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving parts when you're buying digital services. The best thing that the acquisition professional can do, and that really shows a lot of business leadership, is to maintain good files. Neil, I know that the Agile Manifesto tells us that it values working software over comprehensive documentation, but you would still agree that this is good practice, right? It doesn't eschew documentation entirely. But
No, absolutely not. In fact, there's quite a bit of documentation in Agile development. It's just a matter of what actually yields value. Building a system requirements document that takes half the budget and is 300 pages and most of it is obsolete in a month, that is a waste.
Mm-hmm.
But we believe in the Agile world that things like the product backlog and user stories are a form of documentation, that even our tests can be a form of documentation because they show how the application actually works. There's quite a bit of documentation in Agile development. It's just a matter of what can be automated, which is great, and what actually yields true value.
Right on. Yeah, and for the Act Pros out there, as you're hearing this stuff, as you're working on the digital service team, I really do think this is a chance to add value. It's not only about adding value too, but it's about getting informed about the project, right? Like you've got a good foot in the door here to say, hey guys, can I read the stories? Can I read these artifacts? More importantly, I got to get them into the contract file for efficacy's sake. So it's a great way to get involved, right? Rather than just sort of like saying, hey, I want to be a part of this, but showing why your participation will add value.
Yeah, in the lean and agile world, we talk about amplifying learning. And that means learning about everything, learning about ourselves, learning about our fellow project mates, learning about the process, learning about the project and the software. We want to constantly learn. And whatever it takes to accomplish that is very useful.
Nice. That's well said. Cool. So then we continue with the checklist, right? At this point, now we've talked about prioritization. Here's where the rubber meets the road, because we're told now to create a prioritized list of tasks the user is trying to accomplish, which are also known as your user stories. Neil, we're gonna talk about this because ultimately the population of user stories is what informs the product roadmap. It's not linear. Like it's not just take all the user stories, dump them into the requirements document, and then go deliver, because that's waterfall. What this means is that we're taking these user stories and we're using them to understand, at the end of the Agile development contract, hopefully we've designed functionality that addresses the needs that were captured in the user story.
Right. There are a couple of things here I'd like to mention. First, I know the playbook refers to these as tasks. I would call user stories features, and tasks are kind of what comprise the feature. So I mentioned that credit card idea earlier as a user story. Well, that's a very coarse-grained idea, a feature that the user wants to perform. But then there is a set of tasks that comprise that story, both from a user perspective and from the perspective of a developer who wants to actually build that functionality. Second, when it comes to the product roadmap, I see that more as an acquisition artifact versus, say, a developer artifact like a product backlog, which is the collection of user stories that the developing team will use to then guide their process because they've been prioritized by the product owner into the kinds of features necessary to build the perfect product, or at least the best product possible within the constraints of schedule and cost.
Right on. Yeah, no, that's a great point. This is an acquisition artifact. It is designed as a way to enable fixed price acquisition of agile development or digital services. When I'm referring to the product roadmap, what I'm really talking about is a statement of objectives, right? Because each of those functionality boxes that are in there are describing the outcomes that we ultimately want. This should make sense in this slide as we talk about the prioritization of user stories. I think of it, and this is really simple, but I kind of think of it as being on a spectrum, right? So if you think about the functionality on the left as being what would be delivered first in your period of performance, this is where you'd want to have all the must-haves, the critical features that are needed to enable the core function of the digital service. Neil, you had a qualification about this, or actually in addition to what you would say would be a must-have in the roadmap. And do you want to share it?
Yeah, so there are lots of guidance out there in terms of how a product owner should prioritize user stories. What I tend to say is that there are kind of four features or four aspects that a product owner needs to consider. One is value. Value is often measured financially in terms of things like new sales or timing of sales or productivity or things like that. But it's not necessarily that. It could also be, as you say, must-haves or even exciters and delighters, as Noriaki Kano put it in the 80s. Basically, this idea that something that's just really cool and provides a wow factor that yields value for you. So, for example, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, having a treadmill with a TV on it would have been an exciter and a delighter, a wow factor, something that adds a lot of value because it's just cool.
Yeah, but I mean, honestly, like in a government digital service, that might be a critical thing, right? Like if you want somebody to use that service, you might have to put an exciter or delighter. And so I could easily say, yeah, that's a critical feature, right? Like,
right, exactly.
You don't have to have the TV on the treadmill, but I'm going to work out a lot more if there is one versus there isn't one.
Exactly. So there's different ways to look at it in terms of value. There's also, of course, cost. And everyone knows the traditional metrics like NPV and IRR and ROI and such. There's also learning. I mentioned earlier about how in Agile we like to amplify our learning. It could very well be that a feature, by implementing it first, we learn a great deal about either a technology or the project or the product, and that learning itself makes it super valuable for us for mitigating how much time or how much effort it takes down the road to build other features. And then, of course, there's risk. Anything that adds schedule risk or cost risk or functionality risk where we can't get something to work, we want to minimize that. So basically, at the beginning, we want to have high value and even perhaps high risk items.
Okay. And the point being, because ultimately in Agile development, at least, we are bound by our schedule and our budget, not necessarily by scope, but we effectively have, $100,000 and 1 year to create this. Well, it'll probably be a lot less than a year and $100,000 budget. But point being, you have a fixed amount of budget, you have a fixed amount of schedule, and you're going to try to deliver functionality against your product vision to as great a degree as possible. And so that's why you do sort of put those must-haves, those critical features, those high-risk features early so that you ensure that you have schedule and budget resources to address them. Then you can start to think about your should-haves. And these are those features that maybe like a small majority of users would need, or that enable some other part of the core functionality where the product would still work but for this, but it's really like a good thing to have on there. I'm not going to come up with a really good example on the fly. But those were things that you'd probably want to make sure get done. And so you're going to prioritize them, but they just don't take priority over those items and features that Neil just described. Finally, there's nice to haves, right? And that might be minority features that add value or that don't cost a lot, or that, that are just good things to have, but the digital service will work without them. And if you do have room in your roadmap for those kind of nice to have features, it obviously makes sense to include them at the end, so that you're prioritizing what has to get done and not consuming all your schedule and budget resources on the color scheme, right? Which is important. Good to have a good color scheme, but maybe not critical to the functionality. Does that make sense, Neil?
Yeah, you just want to make sure that those nice to haves could very easily be among those 64% of the features that the standards group found are rarely or never used. You just want to make sure that doesn't happen. And so you want a product owner who's knowledgeable enough about the space and the domain and the needs of stakeholders to make these calls correctly.
So you've just given us a preview into a future installment, Play 6 of the Digital Services Playbook, which tells us to assign one leader and hold that person accountable. That is another play. While it's 5 plays away from where we are today, it is something that starts in the planning phase, because the product owner, correct me if I'm wrong, is ultimately responsible for this prioritization.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, that's good. So now as we move into the final check in this Play 1 checklist, we are reminded to regularly test the digital service as it is being built, but test it with potential users so that we can make sure it meets people's needs. Neil, here's the basic chart. Now, again, think about that product roadmap as being a fixed number of releases or functionality. It doesn't even really have to be fixed. This is just helpful for the acquisition professional to think in terms of iterative modular design rather than waterfall design. So as our development team works on each release, they basically deliver functionality, or they're creating functionality through working software or code or whatever. But it's not enough just to say, I coded it, here's the functionality, it's ready to go. Like, it's got to be tested, right? And as it's tested, only features that pass the test are ultimately deployed to the production environment where they can be used to delight the end user. Now, Neil, I know you got something to say about this chart, so go ahead, tear at it.
Well, I just wanted to be clear to everyone who's watching and listening that the testing and deployment should be happening throughout the process, that we don't want to wait till the end, which is very waterfall. And even during a 2-week sprint, if we're talking about a Scrum effort, you don't want to wait till the end to test and deploy then either, because otherwise you've just created a 2-week waterfall, which isn't that useful either. So you want
a microfall.
There you go. A little stream dripping out of your faucet. But yes, so what I'm trying to point out here is that during an agile development effort, and even within that 2-week sprint period, you're testing and deploying constantly, not even at the end of the sprint, but constantly from day 1 or day 2. You are testing and deploying as part of the process. And there are even different levels of testing. Developers will be unit integration testing. There will be acceptance testing where the product owner verifies that the features that have been delivered meet the product owner's standards, and therefore can be put in the win column to add to the velocity measure of how productive you are. So there's all kinds of testing going on at different levels. You even have non-functional tests like security and performance. And of course, you have continuous deployment with things like DevOps and such. And these are happening repeatedly, continuously throughout the process, and not just at the end of a sprint or a release.
And so again, a preview into a later installment, but Play 10 tells us to automate testing and deployment, and you can tell by what all Neil had to say about testing there that type of automation is going to be very important to maintaining flow and to not restricting the Agile developer's ability to what really amounts to continuously release, test, and deploy functionality in support of the product vision. So really cool. So that's it for the checklist. It does provide some key questions. I mean, we're not going to get real far into these other than I'll just say that as you're starting out, right, you, the acquisition professional, if you're writing that acquisition plan, these questions are really helpful, right? Like, who are your primary users? What needs will the service address? Why does the user want or need the service? Like, these are helpful questions for the program folks as they're talking to the users, but they can be helpful to you too as you're thinking about setting up that acquisition plan. What people will have the most difficulty with the service? What research methods were used, and what were the key findings? Anything you want to say here, Neil?
One thing I would mention overall is let's remember that, at least to me, users are more than just actual direct users of the product. That users are anyone who stands to benefit from its existence. And so I want to make sure that all the features that are delivered please everybody
right.
as much as possible.
Great point. Yeah, I mean, you'll hear a lot of talk about stakeholders and users and people who are affected by the digital service. And you're right, it's a bigger population than I may have been describing thus far. Finally, how are the findings documented? Where can future team members access the documentation? How often are you testing it with real people? Like, these are things that you should be thinking about, especially if you're the acquisition professional, documenting the results of these things, documenting what's being done so that we understand later in delivery, why we're making the decisions that we're making. Anything jump out at you here?
I would just mention that also our notions of using the minimum viable product and testing our hypotheses and all these things, while of course they play a huge role at the very beginning of the process, these are things that probably should be continuous, and you should continuously be verifying your hypotheses as you move forward. Because probably especially with a larger project that can take a year, 2 years, 3 years or more, you will eventually get to a point where you want to test new hypotheses.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't want to think of that whole process with the MVP as just being at the beginning, that it's a continuous process. And every time you make an assumption, you need to have the understanding, the humility to test those hypotheses and have the courage to have people tell you that maybe you're wrong.
Wow. Yeah.
And be willing to accommodate them and pivot accordingly.
Very well said. Yeah, that's a great point. Well, that's it for play 1. We're going to continue with play 2, and I think we even probably will combine that with play 3. Those two plays are address the whole experience. That's play 2, and then play 3 is make it simple and intuitive. So we may combine those two plays into the third part of our installment, but I hope you have enjoyed this feature on play 1. And understanding what people need. Neil, really appreciate your time as always. Anything you want to say to take us out?
No, I just hope that everyone learned something, and feel free to email us if you have any questions. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. All right, y'all have a good one. We'll talk to you later.